Hi everyone and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Gladys Lee.
I'm Rath Wang.
Today it's our honor to speak to Chong-Pin Lin. He was the former Taiwan Deputy Minister of National Defense on how Taiwan can mount a credible defense against China. Lin also served as the Deputy Minister of the Mainland Affairs Council. He is a long-time expert on China's military and Taiwan-US-China relations. He was also previously Sanya Sen Chair Professor at Georgetown University. A warm welcome to you, Professor.
Thank you.
On the eve of the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated that a Taiwan crisis is not an internal Chinese matter, but rather one that would rock the global economy. President Biden also repeatedly said that the U.S. military would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Long-standing U.S. policy towards Taiwan merely acknowledges China's claim on Taiwan, while Taiwanese sovereignty remains undecided. Professor, is U.S. policy shifting towards a two-state solution, and do you feel that the U.S. is pushing its allies to switch sides or take sides?
Not that absolute. In fact, in terms of behavior and action, we see some crossing of invisible lines, not red line.
Okay.
But in terms of official announcement or government statements from Washington, that remain largely unchanged. So it's a mixture.
Do you think they changed the strategic ambiguity into clarity, the obvious?
Perhaps in terms of sending officials to Taiwan more and more at higher and higher ranking.
Right.
And other things, for instance, sending U.S. officials to Taiwan to so-called learn with our government officials, things like that. These never had happened before.
Yeah.
These are new actions. However, if Beijing would question Washington, have you changed your status or stance? Washington would say no.
Would
So in
they
terms
always
of
ask
rhetoric, I
so
think-
directly
Yeah.
in between?
So I would say this can be summed up as a phrase coined by Deng Xiaoping in May 1982, struggle without breaking.
So that's what the U.S. is trying to do with Beijing at this point, is to substantially support Taiwan, but stop short of legally changing its official policy.
If I may, let me go back to some background. The current Assistant Secretary of Defense, Eli Ratner, on Indo-Pacific security affairs, wrote an excellent op-ed in Foreign Affairs, I think June 2017, entitled How to Stop China's Maritime Advance. In that, he listed 3 principles, how China would be deterred or stopped and what the United States should do. Number 1, put the countries around China on front, the claimants of South China Sea. And unsaid is that United States should stay in the back in terms of sending combat troops to the ground. Number 2, enlist U.S. allies, for instance, Australia and Japan, to come in and help these neighbors faced by China's advance. And number 3, that's most important, U.S. should continue to reiterate its resolve to defend these countries in terms of attack. So that applies, well, to my great surprise, I thought it was meant for South China Sea, but then the last year, that policy, these principles were applied to Ukraine. Look at, U.S. so far has not sent combat troops to the ground, right? U.S. has supplied arms and all kinds of material to help Ukraine. The U.S. has enlisted Great Britain, France, and Germany, and all the other allies to help Ukraine. So I would say, in the future, if ever the PLA will attack Taiwan, the United States would do the same. Actually, the United States has already done some of these. One of them is to reiterate U.S. resolve to defend for China. But whether that means sending troops to the ground, unsaid. All the other things, arms, assistance, training, and all the others have already come to Taiwan.
Right.
Do you feel that's going to increase in the future as we've seen with the NDAA, new budget in terms of more loans for Taiwan, and they talked about, as you mentioned earlier, sending training assistance to Taiwan.
The trend certainly is going toward that direction. But I think largely it also depends on Beijing. It depends on the interactions between Beijing and Washington. That is not conclusive yet after the balloon incident, even before. I think it is still developing. Why do I say that? Because on February the 6th, after the United States shot down the balloon, which came over U.S. territory from January 28th and shot down on the 4th of February. February 6th, President Biden said, I don't think the incident has weakened U.S.-China relations. So I think things are still going on. And I have heard, or have read that perhaps Biden and Xi Jinping will meet again. Yeah.
Do you feel that it's actually part of a domestic Chinese matter where they're contesting Xi Jinping's power, which we'll talk a bit more about in the second section?
I'm not sure about, because at the same time, another balloon flew over Costa Rica. And on the 6th of February, but actually happened on the 4th, Chinese government apologized to Costa Rica, insisting, however, that the balloon was for scientific research, mainly climate data collection. The same words and description given to Washington. So in this case, China recognized the balloons for the United States and Costa Rica. But China apologized to Costa Rica, the small country. It did not apologize to the United States. Here you have a contrasted behavior of China towards something similar. And one would wonder why China should humble itself by doing that. Apparently, it seems to me it's an accident.
Yeah. But actually, I would like to focus on the key role of Taiwan. Before the balloon gate, actually, President Joe Biden has repeatedly mentioned several times that U.S. force would defend Taiwan in the event of Chinese invasion. And actually, he clarified that this means boots on the ground. And from your commentary beforehand, that you felt like it's no slip of the tongue. So can you tell more about that, talk about that? Is it because Taiwan's strategic role or economic role of the first chain that's so important in between the two superpowers?
I think the Afghanistan withdrawal was a milestone. And even before that, Li Ratner already suggested back in 2017, the best thing for the United States to do is to send all other assistance to the countries involved.
Which we're seeing happen as we talk.
Exactly, yeah. Whether the United States will break that precedent by sending combat troops after the withdrawal from Afghanistan remains to be seen. Yeah, I personally am not that sure.
But in terms of significance, do you feel that Taiwan is much more strategically important than Ukraine? As you know, we're comparing a bit of apples and oranges, but in terms of U.S. global strategy.
Being someone in Taiwan, I would certainly think so, because after all, Taiwan is the most important defender or the guard on the first island chain.
Yeah.
That is paramount importance, strategically speaking, to the United States.
How big of the economic importance is that, do you feel, in terms of chips, semiconductors?
Right, that's something else. Robert Lightzinger wrote an op-ed in New York Times on December 20th last year, suggested the term of strategic decoupling, meaning selective decoupling.
Right.
Why? Because the fundamental economic interdependence is so strong. It is very difficult to ignore that. Therefore, other scholars or officials have already suggested perhaps the tariff thing should be revised a little bit because it hurts the U.S. consumers as well. Therefore, Lightzinger would say there are trades that are beneficial to both sides that should continue. For instance, trade on raw material, agricultural products, consumer products, that should continue. But import of automobiles, computer, and telecommunication equipment to the United States is not. So United States, I think, is moving towards a selective decoupling, not blanket decoupling.
And that's probably in, say, the tech sector, as we've seen with the chips ban and
Yes, that's
more of that.
right.
Do you feel that that will exacerbate?
That certainly is on the trend of becoming stronger and stronger. I don't see any adjustment on that trend so far.
I want to ask you, what are China's motive in revamping the global order among these things happening, like the balloons case incidents, or even the decoupling to Chinese spy balloons, or other decoupling from the chips economically? What's their motives behind from your studies?
I think the most important goal for China currently, not in future, is to continue its path for economic strengthening and military buildup and maintaining domestic order.
Okay.
Everything else, including so-called unification with Taiwan, is not on the first tier. That's the
Domestic?
most important. Therefore, by extension, China is more concerned of a stable world. And that, having said that, I think, although Beijing has not said it, I don't think Beijing finds itself in a very happy position in its relation with Russia. Unsaid, though. I even suspect when Xi Jinping goes to see Putin the next month, he's going to advise Putin not to be stubborn.
To tone it down.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, okay.
Actually, last time Xi Jinping didn't say it, but Putin after meeting said, we understand what you told me, implying Xi Jinping was already pushing Putin, hey, don't do that.
That's interesting.
Absolutely, and hold back a little bit.
Do you feel we could see an end to the war, the conflict in Ukraine?
I certainly hope. I'm not sure that confident.
Speaking of war, Professor, China's drone forces and ballistic missile arsenal, from the DF-21 to 41 to other supersonic missiles, could delay U.S. aircraft carriers and other allied forces such as the Japan Self-Defense Forces in coming to Taiwan's defense. Sam Tagredi, the Lidos Chair of Future Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College, said that if history is any lesson, China's numerical advantage could lead to the defeat for the U.S. Navy. With that in mind, could U.S. allied forces come in time to support Taiwan in the long, or as you mentioned, probably not China's priority now in invading Taiwan?
Mao Zedong said, I think the PLA today still remembers, fight no war unsure of winning, number one. Number two, after year 2000, we have read increasingly frequently that PLA is writing about to make the first battle the decisive one. Meaning if Beijing is not sure, it won't move. If it moves, it is sure of winning. In terms of what? Now, in terms of what I call a war of paralysis rather than a war of annihilation. You know, historically, it's a recurrent mistake. People always prepare for fighting the last war. In the PLA, if the PLA comes to attack Taiwan, it won't be Normandy again. It will be totally different. I think they will try to blind our eyes, even without bloodshed, and break our communication chains and command chains, and they will move very quickly by what? By internal agents. That's what Mao Zedong said a long time ago. He said, we need two things before we move to take Taiwan: aerial superiority and internal agents.
Do they have that now? Do they have?
I strongly suspect they have, and many. Let me share with you an incident I shared already 20 years ago. When I first came back to Taiwan, one day I was invited for a Taiwan television interview. And I was staying with my mother near Taida. One time I hired a taxi. The driver speaks perfect Pekingese, looks very smart, eyes bright. So I said, you're not from here. No, I'm not from here.
Okay.
I think you're from Beijing. Yes, I'm from Beijing. I think you have received higher education. Yes, I have. So what did you do in Beijing? He said he was a master in some kind of a scientific degree. So what are you doing here? I'm here to serve the great masses of people, to compare the two systems, the communist system and the capitalist system. I said, oh boy, Jesus.
Wow.
So how did you come here? He said, I sort of swam ashore, and I found this empty taxi. I started driving. Geez, that sounds very suspicious. So I was telling myself, next time when we stop at the red line, I'm going to jump out and have police arrest him. Then I decided it was too risky. And before we arrived at Taiwan television, he told me the whole history. He knew more than I do. Jesus.
Wow.
So what can I do? After I left, I took down the number of the taxi, the
Run
number.
the plate?
Yeah.
You actually reported him.
I actually gave it to somebody who is the governor. I was a
Right.
professor then.
Okay.
No results. Finally, I met Annette Lu. We were friends. She said, oh, she had something similar. So I said, may I show you the number I took down? And she had a different number. And he showed me the photo, same guy. So it's an organization. That was already in 1995, see?
Wow.
So what's your advice, or what did the vice president say at the time? Did she?
The vice president, of course, he was a legislator at that time. I was a nobody. I was a just teacher, a professor. So I told a lot of people. I told the story to our national security. I hope they do something. Later on, many friends told me they had similar incidents.
Experience? Wow, what a coincidence.
Apparently, not only taxi driver and even the woman in the market, things like that. My friends told me they thought these were crazy people. But after my story became public, these anecdotes I have never heard again. So they became underground.
So do you feel the government has adequately actually gone through these?
I'm not in that
infiltrators?
agency, but I think they certainly should keep a tally. And I'm not surprised if the number has increased.
What about in terms of aerial superiority? Do you feel that Taiwan actually still has that advantage, or do you feel China actually now has the advantage?
China may not have the aerial superiority. However, China has some advancement on these in this technology or warfare instruments like how to call it, the electromagnetic pulse weapons.
Or those
Ignition,
drones and these different...
Right, exactly. Shut out all the computer, nobody gets hurt. Yeah. When I was in the Ministry of National Defense, I strongly urged they always have a backup for all the antenna or the computer because things just may happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
As we've seen last year with Nancy Pelosi's visit and shutdown of 7-Eleven
Right,
computer
exactly.
systems. And,
Yeah.
But do you feel that, going back to that question, do you feel that the US would come in time, or say Japan would come in time, say if China did launch a surprise attack, or do you feel that this lies more on the Taiwanese government, army, and people?
I think we should suppose we should prepare, we should do the best instead of relying totally on foreign rivals or help.
If we
Professor, you think-
ask directly, do you think they have a timetable already from China's side? Let's say, if this term for Xi's end of the term 2027, would you see that's the time?
I don't think so. Let me share with you what I read. A book entitled Xi Jinping's Thought on Army Strengthening, published in 2019.
Right.
Actually, I think you can buy a copy. I don't know how easy to get a copy. And in which several things stand out. Number one, Xi Jinping said China is large but not strong. Becoming strong but not yet strong yet. Historically speaking, this is the most dangerous time. Implication is that Beijing should be very careful. Another one is that Xi Jinping said the practice of PLA of presenting a technology not really ready to coincide with a celebration like October 1, the National Day, or August 1, the Army Day. There's a bad practice. It should be stopped right away. In other words, Xi Jinping's decision for military operation would avoid a time for celebration. 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA. I don't think it would be a good date to launch an attack on Taiwan because he would already see they're not ready. And also the entire world is watching. So it's bad time. I don't think
it would look bad on China, as you mentioned.
And in addition, increasingly more and more US experts on China and even government officials have been saying they don't see it coming. See, Eli Ratner already said not before 2030. So I think 2027 is long gone.
But the elephant in the room here, will it come? Or do you feel it won't come?
Not so soon.
But never say never is what your conclusion.
But not so soon.
We just spoke about US policy over China and Taiwan and what this means for the nation's defense. Coming up next, we'll be asking the minister about Chinese ambitions under Xi Jinping as a cross-strait conflict seems ever so imminent for many.
So, Minister, you've mentioned previously that we should keep an eye on Xi Jinping's ideology, from strategy to the art of struggling, from his wording. So he is different and much more assertive than his predecessors. So what do you mean by that? You're just saying that not so soon from the time we assume 2027, from many experts say. What factors should we focus on or pay attention on the potential invasion? Should it be like a surprising invasion, or what forms that we should focus on?
If Xi Jinping has a choice, he would use what I call extra military instruments.
Okay.
That's the term I used in my dissertation, China's Nuclear Weapon Strategy, published in 1988. That is the strategic culture of Chinese warfare fighting. They would use everything else rather than killing and fighting. For instance, they would use flood or fire.
Unexpected ways.
Or exactly. Okay. These are all non-military or paramilitary instruments without bloodshed. And the decisive blow is usually psychological. So I think they would prefer to use other means, economic, psychological, diplomatic, information technology, rather than pure brute force.
But if that has been exercised and exhausted, then they'll finally come to what you mentioned, force.
That's right. That would be the very last resort.
But do you feel that things have changed since Xi Jinping came into power? Since Deng Xiaoping, he's had a different leadership style with asserting leadership, consolidating power within the party, and with Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Do you feel that will turn or translate into military aggression?
The characteristic of Xi Jinping's policy making is what I would call brute force followed by agility.
Okay.
He did that several times. In 2013.
So it's a carrot and stick approach.
Right. In a way,
with more sticks than
when
carrots.
He comes into resistance, then he will back up and wait. For instance, in 2013, suddenly he announced the aerial defense zone close to Japan. And then South Korea, Japan, Australia, United States all flew planes, fighter or civilian, in that zone. Nothing happened. Beijing didn't do anything. So the whole world was laughing at Beijing, a paper tiger. And on third day, the same speaker from the PLA saying, oh, that is not same as aerial territory. So he backed up a little bit. He did that several times. Brute force followed by agile adjustment. And I think Xi Jinping is in a similar situation now. He has come into strong resistance from the West, around its periphery, for instance, Philippines, changed side. So he has to rethink again. I think he's not that stupid. He will back up and wait.
Also, from the past 7 years when Thai government took the office, also the reflection and reaction was different, totally different from before, right?
Right.
Okay.
And especially the public opinion polls around China's periphery and in the West showed a deteriorating number in favor of Beijing. That's already a big sign. And that's part of the reason why he adjusted the so-called wolf warrior policy.
Will that change in terms of Taiwan? Do you feel that he's going to take a softer stance? As we've seen how when he took a harder stance on Hong Kong, it actually benefited the party that Beijing prefers the least.
I think it is already happening. Song Tao, the new guy from the Taiwan policy, had no background of cross-strait relations. Why he was chosen? Because he did a wonderful job to persuade North Korea coming back to Beijing's friendship circle. And this time he's sent because also he had one time had the responsibility of party-to-party contact for the party. And I was told the rumor, actually he had met our chairman of the Affairs Council, Chiu Tai-shan. And after he assumed the position, we already see they're sending episodes. For instance, the gun murder suspects.
So, Professor, you're saying that he's actually courting both the DPP and the KMT at the same time?
Exactly. Yeah, that is certainly different from what Xi Jinping, when he first came to the power, saying very strong and harsh, feeling-hurting things like, oh, the earth will move and the mountain will collapse if you insist on
It was quite strong.
92's consensus, things like that. I think Xi Jinping has learned a curve. Now he's facing the time of adjustment. I always remember what Ian Johnson said. Ian Johnson was a former New York Times journalist stationed in Beijing for many, many years. He said on the 21st of July, 2019, the 100th anniversary of the founding of Chinese Party, he said that the Chinese Communist Party is the most adaptive party in the world. Look at what the party has gone through. Anti-Confucius to advocating Confucius teaching, anti-capitalism
to being the capitalist.
So one should never be surprised. They will change again. I think Deng Xiaoping's advice, feeling the rocks to cross river, still applies.
Going back to the Taiwan context, so do you feel, as you've been in the military and in all different divisions and also as a professor of Chinese military, do you feel that if Beijing does pull that very, very low probability that you mentioned, what form would it come? What surprise attack should we be looking out for? Like in terms of signs, would it be, say, something would pull out in the Spratleys Islands or something? What should we here in Taiwan look out for?
I think the main decisive factor is the United States' attitude. Beijing is trying to go through Washington to get Taipei.
Diplomacy way.
Yeah,
That's what you mean.
They tried that before during the President Chen Shui-bian's time.
So you don't feel they're going to launch a surprise attack on Taiwan anytime soon?
I don't think so.
If I may ask from different angles, what did you think from the past 7 years that President Tsai did right or correctly to soften President Xi's?
I must say President Tsai has done a very good job in terms of dealing with Beijing.
Like a strong attitude?
She is very prudent. She never would say something or do something to provoke to Beijing. But when Beijing ever criticizes Taiwan unfairly or does something bad to Taiwan, she would stand up. I think she has learned the experience of Mr. King in North Korea holding hands with Trump. That was June 2018. I think she was watching. How would a small country deal with a strong, large country? She learned from Mr. Kim. Always stand up to the big country when the big country says something bad to you or does something bad. Always stand up, but do not provoke.
Okay.
And at the same time, have a nuclear weapon. For
Will we get
Taiwan,
that?
our
Do you
nuclear
feel
weapon
Taiwan
is
will
the
get
United
that?
States.
You-
Our relations with Washington is our nuclear weapon.
So you don't think we have a necessity to actually get a physical nuclear weapon?
It's difficult.
Yeah.
Although we have the
but
capacity.
it was at the consequences of breaking allies, right? President Tsai, at the very beginning, we lost several allies. Would you think that's
Formal diplomatic relations,
Right.
yes, we lost. But informal, informal support, we have amassed, and this support has increased.
yeah, and we unite the democracies
Exactly.
around
So she
as
did a
friends.
fabulous job, in
Okay.
fact. She does not follow her own party sometimes. And at the same time as respect, she has been doing something under the table.
What things do you feel she's done under the table
Some kind of a channel, a suspect.
with Beijing?
I have some clues, but I
You
cannot
know,
prove
or
it.
you suspect?
Because there are several things that are strange.
Okay.
For instance, October 28th last year, there was a news saying that our four major business organizations advised Mainland Affairs Council that they would like to go to China, mainland China, after the Spring Festival. And the response from mainland China affairs was very surprising to me. The response was, we'll be glad to see your successful results.
Act like nothing surprising.
Exactly. That was
okay.
not the way the then vice chairman of Mainland Affairs Council, Dr. Cho, would you normally respond.
Okay.
And many other things gave me some room for exploration.
Speaking of the president, since you actually were in the cabinet around the same time she was, how do you rank how she dealt with the Mainland Affairs Council when she was there? Do you feel that she was effective in dealing with Beijing at that time?
She was, and she was even more impressively effective in performing her role in the legislature. Nobody could win a debate with her. She did not need to shout or act violently. She would just respond with a short sentence. It's like piercing through a balloon, the balloon. She has never lost a debate.
Yeah, we just spoke about Chinese ambitions in the challenging the post-World War II order that has largely been led by the U.S. and how Taiwan is coping with the Chinese threat. Coming up next, we'll hear from the minister on how the nation can best mount a credible national defense strategy. Taiwan could become the next hotspot as U.S.-China competition intensifies.
So let's talk about Taiwan's defense. Professor, as a longtime defense expert, can you talk about how a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan could look like? You just mentioned there should not be a surprising attack or invasion. Which form, from your analysis, that could be?
War of paralysis and something inside Taiwan
Right.
would respond to Beijing. That's the most dangerous episode.
But that's, I guess, already happened for decades. Should we be
It
surprised?
has not really erupted yet. It's
Okay.
potential, it's there.
Speaking of next year, it's still up in the air in terms of, say, who's going to be the next president. Do you feel if Lai Ching-te, the current vice president, becomes president, or if it's a KMT candidate, could that tip Taiwan to the brink of war?
It is not that likely. I think all our leaders or politicians are very careful. Not only because of the risk involved, but also the United States has been very careful. And you know, the Washington usually would publish its own views through Financial Times. We read from Financial Times what the Washington thinks of.
So that's actually
this and-
deliberate. You feel that
Yes.
those views that came out on the FT.
Right, exactly.
Do you feel that there could be, say, more miscommunication? Because war comes oftentimes through miscalculation. Do you feel that Washington and Beijing are trying to prevent that, given with the balloon gate and everything coming in?
Yeah, that certainly is the case. Both sides are very careful, especially the specter of a nuclear war. That is to be avoided at all costs. Therefore, the catchphrase to describe the situation between Washington and Beijing is struggle without breaking.
And as an insider in both, Professor, you've been in both DC and in Taipei. Do you feel that there's anything that Taiwan should be doing more in terms of its relationship with both giants and to, beef up Taiwan's self-defense? It doesn't have to be in terms of army terms. As you mentioned, Beijing has this comprehensive strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suggest a long time ago, 2004, 2005, the term is cement jungle guerrilla warfare. And I was thinking about U.S. involvement in Iraq. The Iraqi guerrilla fighters gave U.S. troops a hard time. And at that time, I knew that the PLA was trying to emulate from U.S. forces. We perhaps take some lessons from how the guerrilla warfighter in Iraq behaved. Well, actually, we are geographically better endowed than the desert. There's no place to hide. We have high rises from the north, the tip of the island, to the south. So snipers, independent squadrons, even the command chain is broken, they can still fight. And they should shoot 2 bullets, 3 bullets here and there to deny Beijing the claim of a quick victory. That is the best deterrence.
And this is what the Ministry of National Defense should be focusing on, guerrilla warfare.
I suggested a long time ago, and I did not really mean a Stalingrad type of war. That is very brutal. I didn't mean that. I mean,
how about the terms of Vietnam, as we've seen, how they repelled the U.S.?
That's right. Small troops, small squadrons, and to be trained professionally so they can fight independently. Therefore, even if the PLA comes in, Beijing cannot claim a quick victory and cannot conclude war. And that is already a deterrent, because if you cannot conclude a war, internal forces will come up against the leader. You made that stupid decision. Therefore, if we exhibit that capability every year, that is already a deterrent.
But do you feel the MND is doing enough to work towards that? Or do you feel that the civil society should also be involved, as we've seen with Puma Shen and the Bears and all these, and mobilizing a civil defense force?
At that time, 20 years ago, when I suggested the guerrilla warfighting in cement concrete jungles, many people did not agree with me. They said, oh, our youngsters are so weak, they faint when they run. I said, no, not exactly. Go to the south of Taiwan, you find a different story. In fact, at that time I was told, even before reading my article, before I wrote that article, some sergeants brought arms back to their country, to their villages, and trained the young people to fight for themselves. I don't know whether that trend has continued, I don't know. But do not underestimate the resolve. We're not talking about the north, we're talking about the southern part of Taiwan.
Right.
So that is a possibility.
So we just spoke about U.S. policy over China. Professor, let's talk about more on the attitude from Washington recently. Do you think the President Biden administration has reacted to China properly, or do you think the administration should get how the relationship with Taiwan to get closely to get the balance for not provoking China?
I would say President Biden has done a wonderful job, not only dealing with the issue in Taiwan, but worldwide. And he has surprised a lot of people. And by strengthening alliances, by doing things just right, for instance, when he took the risk to go to Kiev, he would inform Moscow.
Yeah.
That's
so
very
that they
smart.
don't come in at the same time.
Exactly. So a lot of people underestimated him. And he has done a good job, not only in terms of foreign policy, but also domestic policy. He successfully came and established several laws that would strengthen the United States for a long time to come.
What about support on Taiwan? Do you feel Washington has done enough, or do you feel that we should see more substantial support?
No, I think they have done their best already.
Even speaking of the arms sales part?
with the exception of the arrival of the promised items. Other than that, I think the United States has done everything possible to help us.
Professor, how do you see Washington and Taipei relations going forward? Obviously, Beijing, as you mentioned earlier, is not in a happy place now. Do you feel that there would be more cooperation? And do you think Taiwan-China relations can actually improve?
The trend certainly is that way. However, at the same time, there are different voices in Washington, in the United States. For instance, Professor Jessica Chen Weiss at Cornell University was suggested a refined approach to China. She's now the senior advisor to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So she would suggest the term competitive coexistence to replace what Washington has been doing with Beijing. So that is a variable we need to watch. And Susan Thornton, the former acting Assistant Secretary of State, lately also has mentioned the idea of co-evolution. So these are new ideas coming up in Washington that could somehow revise Washington's approach to China policy and cross-strait. Beijing, well, according to actually Professor Weiss, Beijing understands more than we think they do. So if McCarthy comes to Taiwan, I don't think things would go out of order. Chaotic situation will arrive. I don't think so.
So it'd be
You don't think it would be escalating even far from Nancy Pelosi?
I think Beijing is in the place of rethinking what it has been doing. For instance, after the 20-Party Congress, actually Beijing drastically shifted on 3 areas: the COVID policy, the economic policy. Beijing used to put the state sector above the civilian sector. After Party Congress, now he's readjusted to have the two on both equal footing, and also foreign policy. So I think Beijing is currently in a mode of readjusting a lot of things. And the observation that Xi Jinping is so stubborn, unable to take others' advice, may not apply. The things are really bad for them. I think they need to change. They are changing.
Would you say he's stubborn or patient?
He is confident, but not to that point of ignoring all advice.
Right.
Before the 20-Party Congress, many suggestions came up. He ignored them. For instance, Li Keqiang, Premier Li Keqiang, a long time ago, suggested you should not put the civilian sector down so much. He did not listen. But after 20-Party Congress, he started taking that advice. And other people had suggested to him, the United States is very strong. Don't meddle with the strong power. He seemed to ignore it. But after the Party Congress, that started to shift as well. So I think we should not be surprised if Beijing adjusts its policy on many fronts from now on.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, today.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us.
We end today's show with an interview with senior U.S. military expert Patrick Cronin. Cronin is the Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, a prominent think tank based in Washington, D.C. Cronin is a former senior military and foreign service officer, frequent commentator, and longtime researcher of East Asian defense and collective security. Let's take a look. Patrick, is U.S. policy changing towards Taiwan in light of Secretary Blinken's comments?
Secretary of State Blinken is underscoring the fact that any conflict over Taiwan would have global repercussions that would far exceed what we see coming out of the Ukraine war and Russians' aggression there. Obviously, the container traffic, the semiconductor industry, but just Taiwan's place in the regional and global economy, and the conflict between China and the United States that would ensue from the forcible unification of Taiwan, or the pursuit of that by the mainland, would absolutely be an earthquake in the global economy, the global geopolitics going forward. So Secretary Blinken recognizes that tension across the Taiwan Strait is a global issue. But I think the U.S. posture and the U.S. fundamental challenge is has a constancy to it. That is, we're seeking no unilateral change by force or coercion. We're trying to enable Taiwan to be able to make its choices free from force and coercion. That's sort of the bargain that we struck with Beijing many years ago, and that's what we're holding them to. But China's changing this dynamic and making it much more difficult, both because the PLA's capabilities have grown so much, and also because the Chinese Communist Party's directives, including Xi Jinping's directives to the PLA, are much more assertive in trying to show political will that unification as a core goal must happen and must happen sooner rather than later. And that's putting pressure on the United States and its allies and partners, and on Taiwan, obviously, to figure out how can we help resist the gray zone harassment that has been stepping up and likely to step up more if there's something like a Speaker McCarthy visit to Taiwan this year. But also the idea of stopping unification by force. We have to be able to help Taiwan deny a forceful unification scenario so that it doesn't have to have change to the status quo by force. Reassuring Taiwan by training and by communications and by providing various hardware and other types of materiel, including a resilient cyber security network, making them ready through this kind of training for this porcupine strategy, for a very hardened strategy, but also making the U.S. and U.S. allies like Japan ready to execute a defensive operation against the forceful unification. And ultimately, the question that Secretary Blinken is trying to answer is the one that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, talks about all the time, which is integrated deterrence. And how do you make sure that today is not the day that mainland China thinks that they can use force to get their way with Taiwan? And that's ultimately the objective. But that goes back to the same old policy we've actually been pursuing.
Today, we just exclusively spoke to Chong-Pin Lin, former Taiwan Deputy Defense Minister, and Minister shared with us how Taiwan can mount a credible defense against a Chinese invasion. Let us know in the YouTube comment section if you believe Taiwan is ready to fend off Chinese forces in the event of the surprise PLA attack. Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to the Taiwan Talks YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.